these are the 4 most powerful writing frameworks that I've ever come across. As an English professor and writing coach, I've spent my career analyzing the world's best writers, and what I'm gonna give to you here are 4 writing patterns that once you see them, you're gonna start spotting them everywhere. So today, I want to offer to you a writing framework that'll help you keep your readers focused, a framework that'll give your writing momentum, a framework that'll help you break down complex ideas into simpler units, and a framework that'll help you weave together multiple strands into a single idea. Now, these frameworks are not just style tips or my own list of personal preferences. They're the cognitive patterns that readers use to interpret your text. And by analyzing the writing patterns from the perspective of reader psychology, it's going to help you write more clearly and, more importantly, more valuably. So to start, let's take a look at the same passage written 2 different ways, because this is going to let you in on the principle that underlies all 4 patterns. And so the original passage is taken from Mihail Csikszentmihalyi. Csikszentmihalyi. He's the guy who wrote about flow. But before I get to his original passage from the book Flow, what I'd like to do is look at the same passage written differently, because it's the difference between them that's going to help you see this principle that we're talking about. So my edit, the bad version, says, things that happen are not what produces happiness. Good fortune and random chance don't result in it either. Money can't buy it, and power can't command it. Outside events do not determine it. Our interpretation of those events does. Preparation, cultivation, and private defense by each person are what this condition requires. Now, if I asked you what was wrong with that passage, it might be hard to say. I mean, there's no grammar mistakes in it. It has all the pieces that we need to understand what he's talking about, but something seems a little bit off. So let's contrast that with the original from Csikszentmihalyi's book, which says, happiness is not something that happens. It is not the result of good fortune or random chance. It is not something that money can buy or power command. It does not depend on outside events, but rather on how we interpret them. Happiness, in fact, is a condition that must be prepared for, cultivated, and defended privately by each person. Now, speaking of flow, I think you'd agree that that latter passage was a lot easier to understand, and you might have spotted the difference. But in case you haven't, the key difference between these 2 passages is that in the one that's difficult to understand, we find all these different elements organized in the topic position at the start of the sentence. We see things that happen, good fortune, money, outside events, preparation. And so if you were to look at just these elements in the topic position without reading the rest of the passage, could you predict what this passage is about? Well, let's contrast that with the topics that we find in Csikszentmihalyi's version. We see in the topic position of these clauses, happiness, 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 happiness. So if you were to zoom out and just say, what is this passage about? The one in which all these sentences are joining together. What's it about? It's really easy to say, happiness. And so the difference between the passage that's difficult to read and easy to read has nothing to do with grammar and everything to do with organization. The information is organized so that old, familiar information is in the topic position, and then all the new information comes at the end of the sentence in what's called the comment. And an easy way to think about this topic and comment is to think that the topic of a clause is kind of like a doorstep, and then the comment is the room that the reader is going to walk into. And so with that image in mind, let me tell you about the first writing framework. This is the perfect framework to use whenever you want to elaborate on a single topic, to add more and more details to it. And in fact, it's the pattern that Csikszentmihalyi used in the passage that we just looked at. So returning to that passage, we see the first sentence says, happiness is not something that happens. And so in the topic position of this first sentence, we have the word happiness. And then we see all these pronouns and the word happiness repeated, recurring through every successive clause. All the new complex information is developed in the comment position, and all the topics are coherent. They're all linking back to the same element. And so if you hold on to that image of the topic being like a doorstep, then this first pattern is kind of like you're having the reader stand there and look in the different cardinal directions. There are multiple ideas being developed and attached to this single element that keeps in focus. So as you see, this pattern is what allows us to stay anchored on one topic while developing multiple ideas about it. And it's perfect for whenever you are describing something or characterizing something or just developing a multifaceted idea. You don't want the reader to get lost in all the details, and so this pattern allows you to keep the reader anchored on the one element that you want them to focus on, and from that vantage point, they'll be able to integrate all these ideas that you develop, as we see here in the passage about happiness. Now, this pattern is really handy, but you should be warned that it can create a kind of stagnant feeling in the passage. So you really want to reserve it for moments whenever you really need to elaborate on something and unpack a single or multiple ideas about a single entity. But beware that it is going to make your reader feel stuck because they're standing on the doorstep and they're looking in these different directions. But of course, you don't always want the reader to be standing still. Sometimes you want to give them some movement, and that's what the next framework is for. And by the way, if you want to take a closer look at these frameworks, then you can get my free visual guide to expert writing down below the like button. It contains not only these 4 frameworks, but actually 4 pages of frameworks and patterns that I've used to help writers make their writing more clear and more valuable. Totally free. Link is down below the like button. So what is this second framework and how can you use it to give your writing a feeling of momentum? Well, in the last section, we talked about the framework being as though you have the reader stood on a doorstep and then turning them into different cardinal directions. But with this framework, you want to imagine that from the doorstep, the reader steps into a room. And then from that room, they're now standing in a new room, they have a new vantage point, and the next clause brings them into the next room, right? There's one step after the other, and they're successive steps, right? These aren't teleportations. We're not jerking the reader around the house, one room to another. Everything is linking one into the other, and in fact, that's what the pattern is called, the linking pattern. So let me give you an example of how this works. This comes from James Gleick in his excellent book, Chaos: Making a New Science. So the passage says, outside his window, Lorenz could watch real weather. The early morning fog creeping along the Massachusetts Institute of Technology campus, or the low clouds slipping over the roofs from the Atlantic. Fog and clouds never arose in the model running on his computer. The machine, a Royal McBee, was a thicket of wiring and vacuum tubes that occupied an ungainly portion of Lorenz's office. And so what we see with this framework is that each topic is linking back not to the original topic, but to the end of the previous clause. That is, it's picking up the element that's in the comment and using that as the next starting point. And that's what gives it this sense of forward momentum. So we see the first topic is outside his window, Lorenz. Lorenz would be the first topic. And at the end, we have 2 elements in the comment position. We have fog and we have clouds. Those are the elements that are in the comment position. And then those elements get repeated. They're linked back in the next topic, right? We see fog and clouds. What about them? They never arose in the model running on his computer. And then computer becomes the topic of the next clause. The machine, a Royal McBee, was a thicket of wiring. And notice that at the end of this clause, we are now ending back where we began. Now, that's not absolutely necessary. I'll give you an example, but it's a nice touch. And I'm going to give you another example in a moment to show what can happen when you don't kind of close this loop. But just for the moment, notice what's happening and how this gives the passage this kind of forward motion. Like, this kind of a pattern is excellent for whenever you want the reader to be moving through space. So that could be in a passage where you're describing travel, but it's also excellent. I work in academia, and so this is a really good pattern for the methods section of a scientific report. But it's really useful for anything that involves process, one step after another. If you need to show, or like any causal chain, this is the kind of framework that you'd want to use. But a moment ago, I mentioned that, this is a nice touch, the way Lorenz, the comment of this passage, links back up to the topic where we began. That's a nice touch, because watch what happens if we don't have that kind of a closed loop. Here's the same pattern. It's exactly the same linking pattern, but what you're going to notice is that it kind of falls apart, and I wonder if you can see why. Now, this passage is not from professional prose. It's just something I whipped up to prove a point, but see if you can spot where it goes off the rails. So it says, "Soon Portland will be the coffee roasting hub of the nation. The aroma of roasting beans fills the streets, and gleaming espresso machines line the counters. The machines remind me of my dad's old typewriter, covered with keys I would press randomly. His typewriter always jammed on me. That's why I avoided it. I prefer to write with blue pen on yellow legal pads. This preference has been the topic of heated debates between me and my creative writing professor." All right, now this is exactly the same pattern. We have the topic picking up the comment of the previous clause. But the problem is that, when you zoom out and you look at these topics, just as we did at the start here, when you just analyze the topics, can you tell me what this passage is about? All right, let's take a closer look. All right, this passage is about Portland, coffee beans, espresso machines, typewriter, that, I, preference, creative writing professor. It's hard to see, one way to think about it is to say, it's hard to picture these elements on the same stage. If these are all characters in a play, then you might ask yourself, what are they doing together? Right? So what is this passage about? And that's what happens. It's if you start linking all these clauses together, you get a nice experience of flow or momentum, but as a writer, you kind of need to keep them on track. In other words, you need to keep everything coherent. So it works in this passage about Lorenz because the author is kind of taking us on a guided tour of his office. We start looking at Lorenz, and then we kind of zoom out a little bit and look at the context of the environment. We're kind of floating around in space, and then we're brought back to Lorenz. Now, again, I think there are different ways that you can use this. I don't think you necessarily always need to loop back where you began, but you do need to be careful about the way that you use this pattern, because it's kind of like railroad tracks, and you don't want it to take you too far off course. Now, for this third writing framework, you might notice that it actually breaks a rule. So far, we've been talking about repetition, and sometimes that repetition happens just through repeating the word or using pronouns. And in other cases, we have synonyms being used. So for example, the machine, right? And the Royal McBee replacing the machine, right? His computer. So we can use synonyms or pronouns or just through repetition. But for this third writing framework, you're actually going to notice that it breaks that rule entirely. We don't repeat the same element in the topic positions, but it still works. So let me read it for you and see if you can see how this one works. So this model passage, by the way, comes from Steven Pinker. And it says, when neuroscientists look directly at the brain using a variety of techniques, they can actually see language in action in the left hemisphere. The anatomy of the normal brain, its bulges and creases, is slightly asymmetrical. In some of the regions associated with language, the differences are large enough to be seen with the naked eye. Aphasic brains almost always show lesions in the left hemisphere. Right? So if we examine the topics of all of these successive clauses, we find that there is no repetition. These are all different elements, but somehow they do seem to work together. I don't know about you, but I found that passage pretty easy to read. And so what's the difference between this passage and the one that we just looked at about the Portland coffee beans, right? This one about the Portland coffee beans seems pretty incoherent, yet this one from Steven Pinker works. Why is that? Well, it's a little bit like walking into a cathedral, right? If you walk into a cathedral, you're not going to be very surprised to find inside the nave, the crypt, and the pulpit. In other words, once the whole is on stage, you're not going to be surprised to see its parts. And that's what's happening here. We see the whole element being introduced in the comment position, that being the left hemisphere, which is the language center of the brain. And then different aspects of that one element are introduced in all the successive comments. We have the anatomy of the normal brain being developed in one comment. In the next clause, we have in some regions associated with languages, right over here. And then third, we have aphasics brains. So although these are different topics, they're different elements, right? The topics are indexing different things. Those three things are subsumed below the one topic, the kind of general category that's introduced in the comment position. And this is an excellent pattern for whenever you're providing a taxonomy or just a kind of, you're categorizing something, or you're just breaking down one element into its various parts. Although the parts are going to be scattered and they're not going to be renaming the same topic, whenever you provide this kind of high-level introduction of the category on top of it, almost like an umbrella, then it lends coherence to the whole passage. But for contrast, I think it's also helpful to look at how this pattern can go wrong. So what I'd like to do now is just read you another passage with something missing, and you can try to see if you can tell what goes wrong with it. And so this passage, which follows the same pattern, says, "After gathering the smallest and most colorful leaves from the maples and oaks in our backyard, we place the leaves between sheets of blotter paper, which we then cover with a large, heavy book. In just a day or two, the leaves are ready to be mounted on cards. We use plain index cards folded in half. Using clear adhesive paper, we put one leaf on each card, leaving room for the guest's name." Now, the first question would be, how was that? Was that easy to read? Well, I think we'd all agree no, there's something wrong with that passage. Mosquito attack. And so what is it that's gone wrong with this passage? Well, the thing that it's missing, and the reason why it seems so kind of incomprehensible or disjointed, is that it's missing this index clause, right? If you're going to have a passage which names these varying topics, you need to be specific in naming the category or the kind of super theme that joins them all together. If that theme is only implied, right, if you don't name it specifically where readers are expecting to find it, then they're going to find all the successive clauses in this passage totally incoherent. And so if we were to introduce in the index position a clause that kind of hangs over them all as an umbrella, suddenly they snap into place. Watch. "Each Thanksgiving we make place cards decorated with pressed autumn leaves. After gathering the smallest and most colorful leaves from the maples and oaks in our backyard, we place the leaves between sheets of blotter paper, which we then cover with a large, heavy book. In just a day or two, the leaves are ready to be mounted on cards. We use plain index cards folded in half. Using clear adhesive paper, we put one leaf on each card, leaving room for the guest's name." See, they all snap into place. So that tells you the importance of having a kind of unifying category on top of it all. Now, this last writing framework is excellent for whenever you need to weave together multiple strands into a single cohesive thread. And so keeping with the metaphor that we've been developing here, if the topic is like the doorstep where a reader arrives before we present them with something new, then the comment of this last pattern is a little bit like a tour guide approaching the reader and saying, we're going to go to this room, that room, and this other room. In other words, it's giving them a preview of the major turns that they're about to take. And so let's watch this in action, and then I'll show you the framework and how to use it. And so this example passage comes from Jonathan Haidt. He's an excellent writer, and this passage occurs in his book, The Righteous Mind. And so it says, In their theory of morality, Schroeder et al. Found three major clusters of moral themes, which they called the ethics of autonomy, community, and divinity. The ethic of autonomy is based on the idea that people are, first and foremost, autonomous individuals with wants, needs, and preferences. The ethic of community is based on the idea that people are, first and foremost, members of larger entities such as families, teams, and armies, companies, tribes, and nations. The ethic of divinity is based on the idea that people are first and foremost temporary vessels within which a divine soul has been implanted. And so what you might have spotted already is that the comment of this first index clause sets up A, B, and C. And then those elements that occur at the end of the comment each get picked up in successive clauses. A gets developed here, B gets developed here, and C gets developed here. So that's why it's called a theme preview. It's giving a reader a heads up of the three major turns that we're about to take. But a failure to watch out for with this passage is the use of synonyms. So the reason this all snaps together is because these words echo the terms, the key terms that were put out in the comment position of the first clause. If we were to use a synonym here, communities such as like groups, well, it wouldn't have the same cohesive structure as using the same term or like a very close, not synonym, but analog, like community and communal or autonomy and autonomous. Those are fine because they link back to the same key terms. But if you try to use synonyms here, you're really kind of taxing the reader's mental framework because they have to keep track of these three elements. And if you can help them keep track of that by repeating the same terms, then they can snap the information into this structure. Now, we've been looking at these passages in the context of paragraphs, but keep in mind that these can occur at different levels of resolution and you can even mix and match them. So for example, in a passage, if you can expand this pattern out to an entire section, right? You can imagine the introduction of a section, announcing three major themes, and then several paragraphs being given to element A, and several paragraphs being given to element B, and so on and so forth, linking back with, major signposts like first, second, third to help the reader keep track. Then within this macro structure, you can introduce other patterns, such as the linking pattern, right? You can go old to new, right? New information gets picked up in the old information in that kind of stepped linking pattern in whatever way you can. So try to expand this out into different levels of resolution. And when you're done, you need to watch this video next because it's going to give you 5 more patterns that I see not only at the level of sentence organization, but across the entire essay. So be sure to go check it out.